sum total of your knowledge. If I may, I'm going to start with you, Fiona, and ask about what we're seeing on the Russian-Ukrainian border, what the demands put down by Vladimir Putin really mean, and what you think he's actually trying to achieve.
Well, thanks so much for that. Sorry, I'd put myself on mute for a moment and then forgot to unmute again. Apologies, not a great start. Well, I think I'll start at the very beginning, or rather at the end of your question, rather than at the beginning, because, I think that, what Putin is after, in part, is to get our full attention, and he's certainly succeeded in that regard. That is related to the beginning of the question, which is, of course, we're seeing an unprecedented buildup of Russian forces. Not just to the direct or on the direct border between Russia and Ukraine, but also now what was a game changer, I think, for the administration here in the United States was this movement of troops, artillery equipment into Belarus as well. And I'll just, kind of lay it out there that when I was in government, one of the main scenarios that we worried about the most was the outbreak of a conflict in Belarus that would draw the Russians in, and then would put pressure on other neighboring NATO members like Poland and the Baltic states, not only Ukraine. So that movement of troops and equipment on a much larger scale into Belarus, obviously the rather belligerent tone that Alexander Lukashenko has taken as well, fits into a kind of worst case scenario for some of the United States who are looking at all the various contingencies. It's also, of course, drawn everyone's attention that Putin has moved forces all the way across from the Russian Far East, from the Far East military district, which is not usual, let's just say, in an exercise. I mean, we've seen the Zapad, the West exercises before. They don't usually involve that long train, literally, of equipment going from other theatres. Which again shows that Russia is very serious and that this is not just any kind of normal exercise. We've seen in the past, when you look back to 2008, when Russia moved into Georgia, I was the National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Ukraine, Russia and Eurasia at that time, and of course Anders and Krzysztof will also probably remember, that period. There was an exercise, Kavkaz, the usual exercise that the Russians conducted in the North Caucasus, but there wasn't any unusual activity of other deployments at that point. And that's, of course, just before Russia moves into Georgia. So this, again, is unprecedented. Even if you look at another exercise that preceded an intervention going back to 2008. And it's not just Belarus and the Ukraine border, of course. We've got forces now in Crimea that Russia has built up since the annexation. And there are forces, of course, deployed in the Transnistria region that we're obviously not really sure how the Russians might use them. But in the totality, that is very concerning. It's also been the level of rhetoric that we've seen behind the scenes in Russia. I think there has been some diminution in the anti-Ukrainian rhetoric, bizarrely enough, more recently, but an uptick in rhetoric against the United States and the NATO. We've seen in polling in Russia that the majority of Russians believe that NATO and the United States are the aggressors, or that Ukraine, basically poses some kind of threat to Donbass, which in itself is also fairly preposterous. We've seen rhetoric also about Kaliningrad and a threat posed to Kaliningrad by, bizarrely, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which I thought had actually disappeared many centuries ago. But, we're sort of seeing ourselves in different rhetorical space as well, even though Putin has pressed a pretty hard line against Ukraine now in rhetorical and, of course, in real terms, going back to 2006 with the cutoffs of gas. But again, getting back to the last question again, I mean, clearly the United States administration, and I know that the British share the same assessment, see this again as unprecedented, again as preparations for a full-scale invasion, not just as some regular series of exercises. But the big question is what Putin is going to do. I would say irrespective of whether he invades or not at this point, he has successfully deployed military forces to get attention, to put the world on edge, not just Ukraine, the United States and NATO and UK and other allies on edge. So it's a costly exercise in of itself. So even that is a major development. He has made 3 sets of demands, as we know, in December with these twin documents to NATO and the United States. I don't have to repeat what's in that. I'm sure the committee and everyone else is very well aware. Clearly 3 dimensions: Ukraine, NATO and the United States. And he's hoping that this is all going to be a major game changer. So what does he want right now? Full attention. And clearly he wants a capitulation from us on Ukraine, on NATO, and basically withdrawal of forces and positions since 1997, 1999, when the first big wave of expansion started. And it's clear that he wants the United States to sit down at the table and negotiate a whole series of European security arrangements. And Ukraine has been held hostage to this set of demands.
Now, Fiona, you spoke there about preparations at home. This doesn't seem to compare with the preparations for the 2014 invasion that we remember, when the Russians were talking about the Ukrainian government being fascist, being any number of different things. There don't seem to be the same echoes. Is Vladimir Putin preparing the Russian people at all for a protracted conflict were one to arise?
Well, I think he has set the scene. I mean, there would need to be, I think, a trigger in this point. And that was part of the purpose of the administration, along with, the United Kingdom and others going to the United Nations to put everyone on notice. Because, this is obviously a very familiar scene. As you said, we saw this in 2014. We saw it in 2008 as well, and the preparation for a war with Georgia. We've seen at different times of a menace towards Estonia and the Baltic states with a similar kind of preparation of rhetoric. But I mean, there's been a long trend. I'm sure, Anders Shashin would agree, there's been a long trend in this rhetoric. In any case, there's been no diminution in it in terms of the rhetoric towards Ukraine. At the United Nations, before Nebenza, I think, walked away, there'd already been these statements that Ukraine was fascist, reiteration of some of the rhetoric that we've already seen. But it's the uptick in rhetoric towards the United States that's also been notable. And again, in Russian polling, there is already this sense that the United States and NATO are aggressors. And so there's just, then the fertile ground for some kind of pretext. But again, we've been putting Russia on notice about this.
Thanks very much. And the last point I wanted to raise before I open it up is there's clearly various options that the Russian government has prepared for itself, whether it's the invasion of Ukraine in small or in large volume, or indeed deployments to other parts. What do you think are the chances of the Russian Federation attempting to close that area of territory between Kaliningrad and Belarus, the Suwalki Gap as it's called? What do you think are the chances that it will use troops to change the way that Belarus operates rather than to interfere quite as directly in Ukraine?
I think the chances are very high. I think that, that's kind of part of the risk that we have, that, and this is again a classic Putin move. He's attracted all of our attention to one set of spots and may well do something, elsewhere. So I think we need to be very vigilant. Wouldn't just be a question of Belarus. It could also be, threats, as I said, to the Baltic states. We've seen, rhetoric towards Estonia in the past. Anders and Shashin will probably also recall, I mean, there've been, all kinds of moves that Putin has made against other neighbours, pressure on Finland, for example, Sweden and other countries, especially if Sweden and Finland still have their open door to NATO. And we've already seen Russia consolidate positions in the, former Soviet space. The intervention in CSTO in Kazakhstan, putting troops in Nagorno-Karabakh, after resistance to that for decades by Armenia and Azerbaijan, exploiting the summer 2020 conflict there. Pressure on Moldova as well. There's been a track two that Dmitry Kozak has been running behind the scenes on Moldova and Transnistria, but that also looks more like designed to get leverage over Moldova, given the configuration of its new government. We've seen in Georgia, of course, Mikhail Saakashvili now sitting in jail there, and a complete shift in the orientation of the Georgian government and in terms of their interactions also with Russia. I think, Russia has very effectively now consolidated its position in Eurasia in the post-Soviet space, and Ukraine is an outlier. But also there is a great opportunity here to really establish military bases and deployment of, potentially also missiles in Belarus, and to put the squeeze on Poland and Lithuania over Kaliningrad, as you point out.
Thank you very much, Bob.
Just a couple of quick points, if I may, Tom. Fiona, just briefly, you talked about Belarus. I mean, it seems to me that is something, a big win that's been pocketed by Putin, that the West hasn't even sort of clicked. The fact that in the last 6 months, the last year, Belarus has gone from a country that could just about pretend to be an independent state to either an external or a sort of internal colony of the Russian Federation. So those troops that Putin has moved into Belarus, I assume they're never ever actually going anywhere, and they are now there permanently. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think that's a fair assumption, yes. And also the statements from Lukashenko about potential missile placements. I think that we should be paying careful attention to that, and also in Kaliningrad. I mean, the one thing to point out, though, that this is all about Lukashenko. It's not really about Belarus itself. I mean, this is very much a decision made by him. And as you look around, what I've just said is the consolidated position of Russia. It's very much dependent on their leverage over key leaders. We've seen in Armenia with Pashinyan being reined in a similar way to Lukashenko. Obviously, Tokayev in Kazakhstan, having made the decision to call in the CSTO, has put himself in a very different position than before as well. And so, for Putin, this is, and Russia and the Kremlin, this is all really about leadership. So, should something happen to Lukashenko, I think, the dynamic in Belarus might be quite different, but we should watch that very closely.
Just very briefly on Transnistria, I thought that there were only 3 battalions of a sort of local defence force, and they weren't necessarily aligned to Moscow's aims in the way that they were in the past. You're saying that's not the case?
Well, I'm saying we should watch it, because I'm not quite sure what the situation is there. I mean, I think we often forget and overlook the fact that there are battalions there, as you point out. I mean, they're usually there in just some sort of placement, almost as a holding pattern. But, when you take a look at the map and factor those in, it makes you wonder, whether there is, some potential play there. I think, again, we've also seen Russia, in a way, dangle out the resolution of Transnistria at different points. And what's come to my mind is that they've been doing this again. Dmitry Kozak, who technically has oversight over Ukraine and Belarus, as well as Moldova in, basically the Russian Kremlin circles, has recently been engaged in a track 2 process that, before the whole buildup over Ukraine looked like this was another effort to find a different model of resolution there. But of course, it was also timed with the new government coming into Moldova. And we've seen in the past, when the Germans also organized the so-called Messeberg Initiative, which was their effort to resolve Transnistria, that it was really used by Moscow to gain leverage. The Germans stepped away from that, realizing that there was no serious intent to resolve the conflict, but really just more way of finding how to get a tighter grip over Moldova, or kind of leverage and use it even with Germany. So I would just, so let's watch that as well, because again, there is a tendency for Putin to surprise us, because we're all looking in a different direction. So I'm not necessarily saying that there is something there that I've picked up on at the moment, but just to bear it in mind, just like you said as well, given the fact that the battalions are still placed there.
And just finally, I mean, we've seen, this is now a pretty advanced and sophisticated model. This sort of, I know the Russians don't use the word hybrid, or they claim it's importation from the West. So, but this full spectrum, this new generation warfare, this sort of mix of paramilitary, military, diplomatic, economic culture, I mean, they've really got it down to a fine art now. If you look at what they're doing, as you say, in Central Asia, in the Caucasus, in Moldova, in Ukraine, Baltic republics as maybe a target yet to come. I mean, it's pretty sophisticated stuff, isn't it?
It is, look, and it's internally in our countries as well. I mean, I think part of the problem that we're going to be facing is how we manage with our own domestic politics and the private sector. I mean, when you have senior officials from various countries on the boards of Russian companies, or doing advocacy and basically consulting for Russian companies, SPIEF, the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, I mean, this is really Anders' area here. I mean, I'd love to hear what he has to say about this. Is still advertising, for June. Putin is, convoking meetings with business delegations from Italy, for example. You know, we have an issue here that's also very sophisticated, because in a way that they have bought a kind of insurance package within our own polities and economies as well.
Thank you.
Fiona, I just want to zero in for a second on the core of Russian insecurity and just close off one issue. You were obviously an advisor to the administration that withdrew from the INF Treaty, and presumably that leaves Russia fairly vulnerable to ground-launched cruise missiles in Europe. Russia's built fairly effective defences in air defence and in sea defence, but it is obviously vulnerable to ground-launched cruise missiles. How important do you think this is as a factor in Putin's calculus? How important is a settlement on INF to Putin?
Yeah, look, this is a really good point, and I think it is a very important factor for him. And if it weren't for the current coercive force that's being deployed against Ukraine, I mean, it would actually be a perfect moment for this administration to be negotiating with Russia on what comes next after INF. That was supposed to be the purpose of the strategic stability talks. INF, I mean, just to be very clear, I mean, one of the motivations for the previous administration with withdrawing, although, I mean, I think the timing was a bit debatable, very much, you know, sort of driven by individual preference rather than any exigency at that particular moment, was because Russia had been violating the INF treaty, as I mean, you're well aware, for years. And the whole idea had been, because basically successive administrations had becoming bogged down in a you said this, you said that, you're violating, no, you're violating dynamic. We couldn't break out of it to talk about the next phase, even on New Start, for example. The whole idea had been, after the US withdrawal in August, that there would be then a series of discussions with the Russians on the next phase. And, you know, Putin was very concerned about that. And as I was leaving the administration, you know, back in 2019, it actually warned Trump, for example, that if there was not an immediate follow-on, that the atmosphere could easily return to the Euro missile crisis of the 1980s, which of course is where we find ourselves, with more threats about deployments of missiles in Belarus, Kaliningrad, you know, and elsewhere, with, you know, clear intent to rattle nerves in Europe. So, you know, Putin was already making it very clear, and the people behind the scenes, that they wanted to have a sense of what was going to happen to make sure that there was a guarantee from the United States of no more missile deployments in Europe, some kind of undertaking. And again, this was supposed to be on the agenda for the strategic stability talks that Wendy Sherman was conducting under this administration. So yes, I think this is a major factor for Putin.
So where does it sit in the hierarchy of Russian insecurities?
Well, I mean, it's up there. I mean, obviously, the whole view of the privileged sphere of interest, Ukraine, you know, being back in the fold, missiles, not just the intermediate, but also the long range. And it's not just about the United States for intermediate. It's obviously China and the way that China is developing the Asia Pacific, other countries, India, Pakistan, etc. You know, much kind of broader dynamic. I mean, the hierarchy of things, it's, you know, sort of pretty close to this whole idea of ensuring a privileged sphere of interest and getting Ukraine and the rest of the former, you know, Soviet bloc back under their grip.
So NATO has said not much about this, other than there's no intention to deploy nuclear-armed ground-launched cruise missiles. The UK government has said almost nothing. Should this be an area where the UK government is offering a few more proactive suggestions? Well,
actually, I mean, that was a hope. You know, prior to all of this, that the UK, along with France and, you know, the nuclear powers, would actually have some say in how we discussed all of this. I mean, I think under current circumstances, saying something independently is probably not a great idea, but trying to find a way of coordinating with the United States and finding a way forward that doesn't look like it's done at the point of a missile would be, I think, part of our planning, you know, for what we would be doing if we get out of this current crisis. Again, it's overdue. There'd been a long set of discussions about how to manage the withdrawal of the INF, or really the amendment of the INF and INF phase, you know, 2-3. But, you know, the whole, certainly my colleagues and others who were working on this in terms of strategic stability, were really hoping for more of an omnibus agreement that would cover tactical, intermediate and strategic, so a kind of post-New Start. I think this is why this administration rolled over New START. That was also sort of talked about as a possibility for at least a year or two under the previous administration. But the point was that there had not been a full discussion of everything, because you may recall also there was a question about what to do about China and whether to bundle China into this, which was probably a bridge too far for the sort of initial phases. So I think that this is an area that one could have very serious discussion about.
Thanks, Tom.
But I wouldn't do it individually, because the Russians, obviously will look for a way to, pluck off not just the UK as a nuclear power, but Germany and other countries obviously have a stake in this from their own security perspectives.
Before we move on
that question as well.
I was about to say, before we move on from this, Shashank, do you want to add to this? And I don't know whether you do.
Yeah, and I saw that Anders wanted to as well.
Yeah,
I don't want to be there.
I just wanted to say very, very quick on INF. In theory, it's a sensible topic for discussion, and it clearly is on Russia's mind. And we've heard Putin talking about quite a lot about the flight times of intermediate range missiles from European territory, although the flight time from eastern Ukraine is not all that different to the flight time from the Baltic. So it's arguable whether it's a substantive problem. But what I would say is that clearly this was part of the US strategy, to go into those strategic stability talks saying, well, we're not going to talk about red lines, about rolling back NATO expansion, but we will make a good faith effort to find stuff to talk about. And that's going to be INF missiles, and that's going to be confidence building measures, conventional forces, all of those kinds of things. And one of the things that worries me most profoundly about this crisis and my reading of Russian intentions is that at every step of the way, I see Russia's leadership closing the space for diplomacy rather than grasping it. And we saw Russian diplomats come out of those talks saying, well, missile discussions are good, but it's not what we're here for. And I saw them repeating that message again and again, which to me suggests quite strongly they won't be fobbed off with these what they see as secondary topics, and that from as best I can read it, for them the diplomacy is not a serious effort at finding space for agreement, but a process designed to buy time and lay responsibility onto the other side. So the INF discussion, whilst a sensible one, the way it's actually proceeded reinforces my sense the Russians are not really interested at this point in having a productive, fruitful, substantive discussion on INF range missiles with verification, with all of these things. I really think they are focused on halting Ukraine's westward drift, which is why this is such a dangerous moment.
Yeah, thanks.
Anders, yes, go for it.
Yes, thank you. Let me follow up on a similar line. Fiona, in the beginning here, laid out very nicely how Putin is throwing everything up in the air, and then he hopes to get something somewhere on some issue, and we don't know where, geographically or on what topic. So I think that the Western strategy, I mean here primarily the US and UK strategy, I think has been just right. Expose it all, emphasize as much as possible what is going on, provide as much intelligence as reasonably can be provided. And by doing so, the West is really pushing Putin into a sort of dead end. Either he goes for everything, and then he's likely to lose, or he's not getting anything. The worst would be that he gets something. So you can say that a summit with Biden, that's a big win for Putin. He shows that he's one of the three big leaders in the world, together with the US president and the Chinese president, but it's not enough. He needs something more. The big thing that Putin is talking about repeatedly is Yalta 2, or Yalta 2, you might pronounce it. And he wants to divide the West. Previously, he tried to break Europe out. Now he tries to break the US out and have an agreement over Europe with the US. All these things need to be stopped. And I think that the US and the UK in the strategy are doing exactly the right things. And what does Putin really accomplish? Fiona offered a number of issues, but the fundamental thing is he wants to stop democracy in his neighborhood, and in particular in Russia. He doesn't recognize Ukraine as a state, and he wants to have it abolished. But that is primarily in order to get what the Russians call since the beginning of the 20th century, a small victorious war. So the ultimate aim is to gain popularity by doing something for the nation, and at the same time getting an excuse for more repression at home. So I think that we should concentrate on these things, and what he achieves in terms of specific arms agreement, I think is quite relevant. And Fiona and also Shanka emphasized here that Putin has put everything here in terms of ultimata. This is not a question of reaching an agreement. This is not an opening for a negotiation, but this is to put the West in a corner. But when the West stands up, as it now admirably has done, then he's putting himself in a corner. So I think that we are moving in the place where we should be. And I think it's excellent that you're holding this meeting today, and that you are so focused on these issues. This is in itself something that really harms Putin's strategy.
Okay, thanks very much. Alicia, all yours.
I was just listening in, sorry. Fiona, when it comes to our time in Ukraine, I was slightly taken aback by the fact that the Western intelligence assessments seem to differ quite significantly from those of the Ukrainians. So there was a lot of views when we were in Kiev that any invasion would come over the contact line, and there was some reference to the fact there could be an effort to directly decapitate Kiev, obviously through Belarus. Whereas obviously when we met with the Ukrainians, it was very much the contact line is far too built up, there is far too much defence infrastructure, that is something that's not going to be crossed. It will either be, yes, a direct decapitation of Kiev, or more likely through the south or through other vulnerable parts of their borders. How likely do you think each of those scenarios are, and what do you think Putin is looking at specifically?
Well, I mean, Putin's clearly trying to keep us guessing because he's given himself a lot of options. I mean, there's also air defense, or rather opposite of defense, offense, which could also be used. I mean, if you look at what they did in Georgia in 2008, which is a long time ago, it was more of a sort of a set piece World War II, tanks through the Rocky Tunnel, plus then, use of aircraft. They've obviously adapted a lot since then. The use of covert operatives, different forces, cyber attacks. We've seen obviously the deployment of vessels from the Baltic fleet coming around into the Black Sea with amphibious landing capabilities. So there's also the sea attacks. One could be very concerned about, for example, they've already done this to most rather good effect of the Sea of Azov, blocking off, completely the Sea of Azov to any outside shipping, as well as then taking Mariupol and other Ukrainian ports, threatening Odessa. And the hope being that whatever means that they deploy, that there would be a squeeze put on Kiev. I think we have to also bear in mind the intelligence, obviously, that was deployed, I think, to rather good effect by the UK government about efforts to literally decapitate the Ukrainian government by overthrowing or removing Zelensky and find a replacement. We've seen that happen, through triggers in other countries around the Soviet Russian periphery. So, I mean, we shouldn't rule things like this out either. I mean, I am a little bit mystified, but I think, again, Anders may have some insight into this, given the work that he's done very closely with the Ukrainian government, as to, Zelensky's efforts right now to basically pick fights with various oligarchs and the previous president, Poroshenko. Which also suggests there's quite a lot of machinations going on inside of Ukraine, in its Ukrainian political circles, which Putin and the Kremlin could try to take advantage of. We saw them do that in Georgia, for example, as well as attempt this in Armenia. I mean, another factor again to bear in mind is, as I said before, is just the variety of covert operations that they have. And one thing, obviously, that President Zelensky is very worried about is the market effect. I think, part of the reason that we're getting a difference of interpretation there is the crushing effect on the Ukrainian economy by the threat of war and all of the pressure that Russia is applying. And perhaps that's also being factored in by the Kremlin and by Putin as a way of, getting Zelensky pushed to the margins. So there's a lot of dynamic factors in Ukraine that the Russians can use. So I think it's, in some respects, a bit risky for us to focus in on one issue. Obviously, the United States government, based on the intelligence that they have, has laid out the maximal possible invasion that that is feasible, but there are many different other ways that Russia can deploy the forces that it's arraigned, and that's of course the difficulty that we have.
Absolutely, and I don't know, Mr. Anders, if you'd like to comment on that at all. Mr.
Anders. Yeah, thank you. I would like to pick up on 2 points. One, what Fiona mentioned, the Ukrainian politics are very divided, and President Zelensky is now trying to prosecute former President Prystaiko, his main political rival, for high treason. I saw Prystaiko last in October, and he said that there were then 129 criminal cases opened against him. President Zelensky completely controls the prosecutor general. So this is a political